The truck that dropped him off didn't slow down enough to be called a stop. The driver, a heavy-set man hauling feed to Billings, had said maybe 4 words the entire 3 hours from the Idaho border, which suited Logan just fine. The door swung open somewhere on a 2-lane highway outside of Prairie, Montana, and Logan stepped out onto gravel with nothing but a canvas duffel bag, a worn jacket that had survived things the canvas never would, and the particular kind of silence that follows a man who has learned to carry his own weather. The Absaroka Range rose ahead of him like a wall the earth had thrown up against the sky. Late October had already stripped the aspens down to bone, and the grass along the roadside had gone the color of old whiskey. The air smelled of pine resin, cold water, and something wilder underneath. Elk, maybe, or just the specific loneliness of country that doesn't apologize for what it is. Logan breathed it in and felt something in his chest loosen by a fraction. He'd been moving for 8 months. After the business in Vancouver, the less said about Vancouver the better. He drifted south through British Columbia, then east through the Idaho Panhandle, picking up day labor where he could find it and avoiding anywhere that had too many cameras or too many people who asked questions about the scars. He wasn't hiding exactly. Hiding implied someone was looking. This was something older and simpler than hiding. This was a man who had lived long enough to know that the only thing worse than being alone was pretending you weren't. A rusted sign half buried in roadside brush read, "Clearwater Ranch, help wanted, inquire at gate." Logan adjusted the duffel on his shoulder and started walking. Clearwater Ranch was not the Dutton operation. That was important to understand from the beginning. It sat on 1,100 acres of decent grazing land, about 6 miles east of the Yellowstone River, hemmed in on 2 sides by Dutton-controlled territory, and on a third by a stretch of federal land that everyone in the valley seemed to have opinions about. The owner was a retired Army sergeant named Carl Hauser, who ran about 400 head of Angus cattle and had recently lost 2 ranch hands to the Dutton payroll, which paid better and came with a particular kind of protection that money alone couldn't buy in this corner of Montana. Hauser looked Logan over the way men who have seen real things look at other men who have seen real things. And he didn't ask about the scarring along Logan's jaw or the unusual density of the forearms visible beneath the rolled sleeves. He asked if Logan could ride, fix fence, pull a calf in a difficult berth, and keep his mouth shut when it was required. Logan said yes to all 4. He was given a bunk in a converted outbuilding with 2 other hands. A quiet Crow man named Eddie Runningwater, who'd worked the ranch for 3 seasons, and a younger kid from Billings named Cody who talked too much and meant well enough. The bunk was narrow and the mattress had lived a full life, but the roof was solid and there was a wood stove in the corner that threw real heat, and Logan had slept in places that made this look like the Ritz-Carlton. That first week he worked. That was the whole of it. Just work. The clean animal grammar of physical labor. The kind that filled the hours without leaving room for the other things to crowd in. He mended 300 yards of fence along the eastern pasture. He helped Eddie move a small herd to lower ground ahead of a cold front that the Weather Service had underestimated by about 2 days, because Logan had smelled it coming since Tuesday. He pulled a calf on Thursday morning in the blue dark before sunrise, kneeling in frozen mud with his arms inside a laboring heifer. And when it was done, he stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans and watched the calf find its legs and felt something that wasn't quite peace but was at least in the same county. Hauser noticed he was a hard worker. Eddie noticed he was careful, precise in a way that suggested someone who had learned the cost of imprecision. Cody noticed that Logan drank his coffee black and never touched the whiskey in the bunkhouse, and sometimes sat outside on the step at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing, which Cody found mysterious and Eddie found familiar. The Duttons noticed him on day 9. It wasn't anything dramatic. A Dutton pickup, black, newer model, Yellowstone brand on the door, had slowed on the county road while Logan was working the fence line closest to the property boundary. The window came down and a man sat there for a long moment, engine idling, watching. Not hostile exactly, territorial. The way a rancher surveys anything new inside his peripheral vision, cataloging it, filing it under unknown, monitor further. Logan didn't look up from the fence post he was setting. The truck sat there for another 30 seconds, then rolled on. That evening, Hauser found Logan in the barn and mentioned, with the careful tone of a man navigating something delicate, that the Duttons liked to know the personnel situation on neighboring spreads. Not because they were nosy, because in this valley information was a form of property, and the Duttons were particular about property. "They going to be a problem?" Logan asked. Hauser considered that honestly. "Depends entirely," he said, "on whether you're the kind of man who makes problems or the kind who absorbs them." Logan picked up a brush and went back to working down the flank of a sorrel mare who'd been spooked by something in the north pasture all afternoon. The mare settled under his hands immediately, which horses always did, for reasons Logan had never fully understood and had long since stopped questioning. "I've been both," he said. "Ikuit, I'm trying for the second one." Hauser nodded like that was the most honest answer he'd heard in a long time, which in this valley it probably was. Outside, the Absarokas had gone dark against a sky full of cold stars, and somewhere to the west, on land that had been Dutton land for 3 generations and would be Dutton land over a great many people's dead bodies, the lights of the main house burned steady and bright, the particular brightness of people who have decided, in the face of everything, that they will not be moved. Logan pulled his jacket tighter and listened to the wind come down off the mountain. He'd heard that kind of resolve before. In men, in families, in the walls of places that didn't know yet what was coming. He hoped this time he wasn't what was coming. In the Yellowstone bunkhouse had a reputation that traveled ahead of itself like weather. Every ranch hand in a 3-county radius knew what it meant to wear the Dutton brand. The actual brand, burned into the skin above the hip bone, a mark that was equal parts loyalty oath, criminal record, and declaration of war against anyone who tried to touch what the brand protected. The men who wore it didn't talk about it much. They didn't need to. It was visible in the way they carried themselves through a feed store or a bar in Livingston. A specific gravity, the posture of men who had been chosen for something and understood the full weight of that choosing. Rip Wheeler was the reason those men were the way they were. He'd built the bunkhouse culture the way a craftsman builds something meant to outlast him. Carefully, and without sentimentality, with absolute clarity about what the finished thing needed to do. The men under him were loyal not because they feared him, though fear was present and honest, but because Rip had a quality that genuine hard men respond to above all others. He was exactly what he appeared to be. No performance, no politics, no gap between the face he showed and the thing underneath. What you saw was what existed, all the way down. He'd heard about the new hand at Clearwater within 48 hours of Logan's arrival. That was simply how information moved in this valley. By the end of Logan's first week, Rip had a basic profile assembled from sources he didn't need to explain to anyone. Canadian, or at least that direction. No employment history that checked out past about 3 years back. No social media presence. So no credit footprint worth mentioning. No vehicle registered in any name that matched the one he'd given Hauser. Paid cash for a pair of boots at the ranch to supply an emigrant, and hadn't said more than 6 words to the woman at the register, who had noted that his hands looked like they'd been through something industrial, and his eyes looked like he was doing a constant, quiet calculation that had nothing to do with the boots. Rip brought this to John Dutton on a Wednesday evening, while John was going over grazing rotation maps at the kitchen table, which was where most of the real business of the ranch got done, under the kind of overhead light that didn't flatter anyone. John listened without looking up from the maps. "You want me to go talk to him?" Rip said. It wasn't a question. "I want you to go get a sense of him," John said. "There's a difference." The opportunity presented itself naturally, the way things do in ranch country, where the work creates its own social architecture. A section of shared fence line between Clearwater and Dutton territory had been damaged by a dead cottonwood that had come down in the last wind event, and the practical thing, the ranching thing, was for hands from both outfits to work it together rather than argue about whose tree it technically was. Hauser called John, John told Rip, and on a gray Friday morning, Rip drove out to the boundary line with 2 Dutton hands and found Logan and Eddie Runningwater already there, chainsaws and post-pounders in the bed of the Clearwater truck, assessing the damage with the focused economy of men who wanted to finish before the clouds delivered on their promise. Rip stood back for a moment before anyone acknowledged him and watched Logan work. It was the first thing he always did with a new man. Watch before engaging, because a man at work tells you everything that conversation will spend an hour trying to obscure. What he saw was efficient, unhurried, and quietly authoritative, in a way that had nothing to do with dominance. Logan moved around the fallen tree like he had already solved the problem in his head and was now simply executing the solution, his body doing the work without consultation, the chainsaw in his hands handled with a familiarity that suggested long acquaintance with tools designed to cut through hard things. The scarring was visible even from 20 feet, the jaw, the neck, the backs of the hands, old and layered. Hey, the kind of scarring that accumulated over decades rather than incidents. Rip had his own history written in his skin and recognized the grammar of it in another man. Logan looked up. Their eyes met across the fallen cottonwood. Neither man said anything for a moment. It was the particular silence of two dogs encountering each other on a road. Not aggression, not friendliness, just the careful mutual inventory of things that have learned to be accurate about what they're dealing with. Wheeler, Rip said. Logan said. They went to work. By noon, they'd cleared the tree, reset 4 posts, and restrung 80 yards of fence. Rip worked hard and without complaint, which Logan respected. The two Dutton hands were competent and took their cues from Rip without requiring management, which told Logan something about how that operation ran. Eddie worked steady as a clock. The only weak link was a young Dutton hand named Travis, who tried twice to make conversation about football and was gently ignored by everyone, including himself, by the second attempt. They ate lunch at the tailgates of the 2 trucks, sandwiches and thermoses of coffee, the mountains indifferent above them. Rip sat across from Logan with the direct, undecorated attention of a man conducting an assessment he didn't intend to disguise. "How long you planning to stay at Clearwater?" he asked. "Long as the work holds," Logan said. "What did you do before?" Logan took a drink of coffee. "Whatever needed doing." Rip nodded slowly, like that was an answer he understood, and also like he understood it told him nothing. "You got a record?" "Nothing current." "That's a careful answer." "It's the accurate one." Rip was quiet for a moment, turning his thermos cap in his fingers. Around them, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something being slowly erased. "Man comes to this valley with no history and careful answers," Rip said, not unkindly. "Usually one of 3 things: running from something, looking for something, or done with something." Logan looked out at the fence line they'd repaired, the new posts bright against the weathered ones, the wire running clean and taut to the horizon. "Third one," he said. Rip studied him for another long moment with eyes that had spent years learning to sort true from false, and something in what he found there. Not warmth exactly, but an absence of falseness that was its own kind of credential, made him nod once, definitively, and let it go. They finished their coffee. The clouds came in from the northwest around 2 o'clock and delivered exactly what they'd promised. Both crews were already gone. The trouble started, as trouble in this valley almost always did, over land. There was a stretch of creek-fed pasture along the northeastern edge of Clearwater's property that had been disputed in a quiet, unresolved way for the better part of a decade. Not disputed in the legal sense. The survey markers were clear enough, and the deed language wasn't ambiguous. Disputed in the older, more fundamental sense that exists in ranch country, before and beneath the law, where the question isn't what the paper says, but who has the will and the capacity to make the paper mean something when the paper isn't there. A developer out of Bozeman named Garrett Langley had been acquiring parcels on the valley's eastern edge for 18 months, assembling land the way a man builds a sentence. Word by word, each acquisition making the next one more grammatically inevitable. He'd gotten 3 small spreads already, 2 retired couples and a cattle operation that had been underwater since the drought year. Clearwater was the next logical piece, and the creek pasture, specifically, was the piece that made Clearwater worth the trouble. Because it sat at the natural drainage point for 2,000 acres of higher ground that Langley had already optioned from the federal land office through a political mechanism that nobody in the valley had fully understood until it was done. John Dutton understood it. John Dutton understood it the way he understood most threats to this valley. Completely, in approximately 3 months after the moment when understanding might have been preventative. He sat on his porch on a Sunday morning with coffee and the particular expression he wore when he was doing arithmetic that came out wrong no matter how many times he ran the numbers. Beth was inside, which meant she already knew and had already formed opinions that were likely to generate paperwork for someone. Jamie was in Helena, which meant he was either part of the solution or part of the problem, and John wasn't certain yet which. Case was down at the livestock pens with his son, doing the ordinary work of a Sunday, the kind of morning that John was increasingly aware he needed to protect not just as a ranching operation, but as a thing in itself. A morning, a boy learning from his father, the specific quality of light on the Yellowstone at 8 a.m. in late October. Rip came around the corner of the house with his own coffee and the look of a man who had information to deliver and wasn't delighted about it. Langley's people were on the Clearwater Creek pasture yesterday afternoon, he said. 3 men with survey equipment. Hauser ran them off. They left, but one of them told Hauser's hand they'd be back with documentation. John looked at the mountains. What kind of documentation, he asked. The kind Beth's going to want to set on fire, Rip said. Logan heard about it from Eddie that evening, the story moving through the bunkhouse the way stories do when they carry the particular electrical charge of something that is about to change the texture of daily life. Hauser had come in from the confrontation, tight-jawed and quiet, which was worse than if he'd come in angry, because quiet meant he was doing the math, and the math wasn't good. Cody characteristically wanted to know if there was going to be a fight. Eddie characteristically said nothing, and sharpened a knife he'd sharpened the previous evening. Logan sat on his bunk and listened, and thought about the 3 men with survey equipment. He'd smelled them before he'd known what he was smelling. Mid-afternoon, north wind carrying it down from the creek pasture 2 miles out. City soap, synthetic fiber, the particular chemical signature of equipment recently unboxed. Not ranch people, not hunters. Something administrative, which in his experience was its own category of dangerous. He hadn't said anything about it. It wasn't his land, it wasn't his fight. He was a hand on a neighboring spread trying to be the third thing he'd told Rip Wheeler he was. Done, finished, retired from the business of being the sharp end of other people's problems. He repeated this to himself with the conviction of a man who doesn't quite believe what he's saying. They came back on Tuesday. Not 3 men this time. 5 in 2 trucks that were too clean for ranch roads. We with a lawyer in the lead vehicle and a document that Langley's people had apparently constructed with some ingenuity, a challenge to the original survey based on a 19th century land grant that someone had located in the Gallatin County historical records and interpreted with the specific creativity that sufficient legal fees can generate. Hauser met them at his gate with Eddie beside him, and his hand on the fence post in the expression of a man who has already decided where his line is. Logan was fixing a water line behind the barn, 50 yards away, downwind. He heard the conversation clearly, all of it. The lawyer was practiced and pleasant in the way that people are when they have decided that pleasantness is tactically superior to honesty. He used phrases like good faith resolution and mutually beneficial outcome, and our client's sincere desire to work collaboratively with neighboring operations. Hauser said very little. Eddie said nothing. The 5 men spread slightly, not aggressively, just enough, in the unconscious choreography of people who have done this before, and know that physical presence is its own form of argument. One of them, a thick man in a canvas jacket who was not a lawyer and was not there for documentation purposes, moved a half step closer to Hauser than the conversation required. Logan set down his pipe wrench. He came around the corner of the barn at a walk, not rushing, not performing, just a man moving with the quiet, load-bearing purposefulness of something that has decided to be present. And he stopped about 10 feet from the group and stood there with his hands loose at his sides and looked at the man in the canvas jacket with the specific quality of attention that is not a threat and is also not nothing. The man in the canvas jacket looked back. Something moved through his expression that he didn't fully control. A recalibration, an instinctive reassessment happening below the level of conscious thought. The ancient mammalian circuitry that exists in all of us for the precise purpose of evaluating whether the thing in front of us is more dangerous than we initially estimated. He took the half step back. The lawyer continued talking for another 40 seconds before he noticed that the dynamic had changed. He looked at Logan. Logan looked at him with the patient, empty attention of a man with nowhere else to be and no particular investment in the lawyer's comfort level. "And you are?" the lawyer asked. "Nobody," Logan said. "Just finishing a water line." The lawyer made a decision that his instincts were better than his billing rate and wrapped up the visit shortly thereafter. The trucks turned around on the county road and headed back toward Bozeman. Hauser watched them go, then looked at Logan for a long moment. "That water line done?" he asked. "Close enough," Logan said. That evening, Rip Wheeler's black truck sat on the county road for a full minute longer than usual before it moved on. Rip Wheeler did not believe in coincidence. It wasn't philosophy, it was methodology. The operational framework of a man who had survived long enough in a violent world to understand that the things which appear accidental are usually the visible surface of something deliberate moving underneath. So when three separate people, across three separate conversations, mentioned the Clearwater Hand in the same week, Hauser's feed supplier, a Dutton hand who'd been in the same bar in Gardner on Saturday night, and a county sheriff's deputy who owed Rip a professional courtesy, he treated it the way he treated all accumulating evidence, as information that required a response. He drove out to Clearwater on a Thursday morning without calling ahead. That was intentional. A man you call ahead to visit has time to become the version of himself he wants you to see. A man you arrive on unannounced is just himself, which was the version Rip was interested in. He found Logan splitting wood behind the bunkhouse. Not because anyone had asked him to. There was a hydraulic splitter sitting idle 20 feet away. Logan was using a maul, working through a cord of knotty pine with the methodical, almost meditative rhythm of a man who had chosen the harder tool on purpose. For the resistance, maybe, or for the specific quality of silence that sustained physical labor creates around a person when they need it. The pile of split wood growing beside him was large enough that he'd clearly been at this for some time. Rip parked and got out and leaned against his truck and watched. Logan didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him immediately. Set the next round, found the grain with a glance, on and drove the maul through it with a single clean stroke that required no follow-through because it had been placed correctly the first time. Then he set the maul against the block and looked at Rip. "Wheeler," he said. "You got a few minutes?" Rip asked. "I got wood to split." "I'll help," Rip said, and picked up a spare maul leaning against the bunkhouse wall before Logan could respond to that, which was itself a message about how this conversation was going to go. They worked in silence for a while, which was fine by both of them. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that justifies itself by making everything sharper. The outline of the mountains, the smell of pine sap in the split wood, the sound of the maul strikes carrying a clean distance before the valley swallowed them. Two men doing honest work together will sometimes arrive at a truthfulness that direct conversation takes much longer to reach. And Rip understood this the way he understood most things about human beings, practically from long observation. After 20 minutes, he said, without breaking rhythm, "Tell me about Tuesday." Logan set the maul. "Told it to Hauser same day, nothing to add." "I'm not asking what happened," Rip said. "I'm asking about you. Specifically, I'm asking about the way that man in the canvas jacket looked at you." Logan picked up the next round and set it on the block. "How'd he look at me?" "Like he saw something that scared him and didn't know what it was." The maul came down, clean split. "People get nervous," Logan said. "Not like that," Rip said. "I've seen nervous. I've made nervous. Shiana, that was something different." Logan stacked the split halves without answering. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not comfortable, but not hostile either. It was the silence of a question that had been put on the table and was being looked at by both men from different angles. Rip stopped splitting and turned to face Logan directly. He had a way of doing this, a full, deliberate reorientation of his attention that communicated that whatever came next was off the record of daily transaction and on the record of something more serious. "I don't need your whole story," he said. "I don't care about your whole story. What I need to know is whether you're going to be a problem for Hauser. Because Hauser's got enough problems right now, and what's coming from Langley is going to get worse before it gets better. And I don't need a variable. I can't read sitting 6 miles from Duttonland while that's happening." Logan looked at him steadily. You protecting Hauser or protecting Dutton? Both, Rip said without hesitation or apology. Same thing in this valley. Logan nodded slowly, like that was an honest answer, and he could respect an honest answer. He picked up the maul again, turned it in his hands once, and then did something that Rip would think about afterward for a long time. He held out his forearm, pushing the jacket sleeve back to the elbow, and showed Rip the underside of his wrist. The scarring there was different from the rest. Not the accumulated damage of a life lived hard, but something deliberate and deep and very old, the kind of scarring that had a specific origin and a specific story and had been shown right now, when as an act of controlled disclosure. I know what it means to be branded, Logan said. I know what it means to belong to something because of what was done to your body without your consent. He let Rip look at it for a moment, then pulled the sleeve back down. I'm not running from Hauser, and I'm not working against him. I'm working for him because he gave me work and didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. Same deal I'm offering you right now. Rip was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines at the tree line with a sound like distant breathing. What are you? He asked. Not aggressively, the way a man asks a question when he genuinely doesn't have a category for the answer. Logan picked up the next round and set it on the block. Complicated, he said, and brought them all down. Why, it happened at the end of that sentence before the echo of the split had finished traveling. One of the halves had spun off the block at an odd angle, and a jagged splinter, pine sharp as a blade at the broken edge, drove itself into Logan's forearm just below the sleeve line. A bad one, deep enough to matter, the kind of wound that would send a normal man to look for a first aid kit and a normal man's employer to look for a liability waiver. Logan looked down at it. Rip watched. The bleeding stopped in roughly 4 seconds. The edges of the wound, which Rip could see clearly from 6 feet away, moved. Not dramatically, not like something from a movie, but with the quiet, business-like efficiency of a process that had been engineered rather than evolved. In under a minute, there was nothing on Logan's forearm but a thin pink line and the stain of dried blood on his skin. Rip did not step back. That was a thing worth noting about him. He did not step back. He looked at what he'd seen with the flat, absorptive attention of a man recalibrating rather than reacting, filing what he'd witnessed under a new category that he was in the process of creating. Logan met his eyes. Neither of them said anything for what felt like a long time. Complicated, Rip said finally, with the careful, almost archaeological tone of a man who has just understood something that changes the shape of everything around it without yet knowing the full dimensions of the change. Yeah, Logan said. Rip picked up his maul and split the next round. They finished the cord together and didn't speak again until it was done. And when Rip drove back toward the Dutton Ranch, the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been handed a problem that doesn't fit any of the existing boxes and is going to need to think carefully about whether to build a new box or burn the whole cabinet down. Beth Dutton had a gift for identifying leverage. It wasn't something she'd been taught, though her father had refined it in her the way a whetstone refines an existing edge, rather than creating one from nothing. It was constitutional, written into her at a level below strategy, a biological fluency with power, and its pressure points that made her, in boardrooms and courtrooms and the particular theater of family dinner tables, one of the most dangerous people in any room she chose to enter. And Rip had told her about Logan the same evening he'd come back from Clearwater. Not everything. Rip had a quality of discretion that was one of the things Beth loved about him most fiercely. But enough. A man who heals. A man who's been branded against his will. A man sitting 6 miles from Dutton Land with no history and no future, and skills that don't have a clean name. Beth had listened without interrupting, which was how you knew she was genuinely interested rather than just waiting for her turn. When Rip finished, she poured 2 fingers of bourbon and looked out the kitchen window at the dark. Langley's going to move on Clearwater within 30 days, she said. He's got the legal instrument, and he's got a county commissioner in his pocket, and he's got a judge in Bozeman who owes his career to the same development consortium that's been building Langley's war chest for 3 years. She drank. Hauser can't fight that. Not financially, not legally, not in the time frame that matters. We could back him, Rip said. We're already backing 3 other challenges, Beth said. Financially and legally we're extended, and Jamie's political capital in Helena is currently worth approximately nothing after the last session. She turned from the window. But a man who heals, who can't be reasoned with by conventional means, who has apparently been making Langley's professional muscle reconsider their career choices? Beth, Rip said, hammering with the tone he used when he was about to remind her of the distance between an idea and a good idea. I'm not going to do anything stupid, she said. I'm going to go have a conversation. She drove to Clearwater the following afternoon alone, which was a choice that communicated its own kind of confidence. Beth Dutton arriving without backup was not Beth Dutton being careless. It was Beth Dutton communicating that she didn't consider backup necessary, which was a different and more unsettling statement. Logan was repairing a section of roof on the equipment shed when her Range Rover came up the drive. He watched her get out from 20 feet up without moving from his position on the roof, which was itself a response. A refusal to descend on someone else's schedule, a quiet assertion that the conversation would begin when he chose. Beth looked up at him with an expression of pure assessment, the kind that most people find uncomfortable because it makes no effort to disguise itself as anything warmer. You gonna come down, she said, or should I come up? I'm almost done, Logan said, and finished the section he was working on before climbing down. His boots hit the ground and he turned to face her, and something moved through her expression briefly. The same involuntary recalibration that the man in the canvas jacket had experienced, though Beth processed it differently, filing it immediately under asset rather than threat. Beth Dutton, she said. I know who you are, Logan said. Good. Saves time. She put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at him with the direct, economy of motion quality of someone who considers social lubrication a form of condescension. I want to talk to you about Langley. Not my problem, Logan said. It will be, Beth said. In about 3 weeks, it becomes very specifically your problem. Because when Langley takes Clearwater, and he will take it, I want to be honest with you about that. Hauser's operation folds and your paycheck stops, and you find yourself back on whatever road you came off of. She paused. Unless someone stops him. Someone meaning me, Logan said. Someone meaning us, Beth said. Cooperatively. Logan looked at her steadily. The afternoon light came at a low angle across the equipment yard and caught the dust from his roof work still hanging in the air between them. And in that light, Beth Dutton looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had decided she wanted something and had arrived to collect it, wearing her intentions openly because she learned that transparency was more frightening than deception to most people. What would that look like? Logan said carefully. Cooperatively. Langley's people respond to physical discouragement, Beth said. We've established that. What we need is someone who can be physically discouraging in a sustained, incredible way over the course of several weeks while we work the legal angle from Helena. She met his eyes. Someone who doesn't need backup, doesn't need recovery time, and won't appear on any payroll that can be subpoenaed. The yard was quiet around them. Or in the near pasture, a group of Angus moved in the slow, collective drift of cattle with nowhere particular to be. Logan felt something old and specific tighten in his chest, the particular constriction of being looked at as a tool. It had a recognizable texture, this feeling. He'd felt it in government facilities with fluorescent lighting. He'd felt it in briefing rooms with men in uniforms who talked about assets and deployment windows and didn't use his name. He'd felt it every time someone had looked at what he was capable of and seen only what it could do for them. No, he said. Beth blinked. It was subtle, but it was there. The microsecond of genuine surprise at a word she hadn't expected in this position. No, Logan said again, quieter. I'm not your weapon. I'm not anyone's weapon. I spent a long time being somebody's weapon, and I'm done with it. Beth looked at him for a long moment. The assessment in her eyes hadn't changed, but its quality had. She was updating, recategorizing, running new calculations. Then what are you? She asked. It was the same question Rip had asked, but from a completely different direction, with a completely different architecture of meaning underneath it. Logan picked up his tool belt from the ground and slung it over his shoulder. A ranch hand, he said. That's all. He walked back toward the equipment shed. Beth Dutton stood in the yard and watched him go, with the expression of a woman who has been told no and is deciding whether that makes her angrier or more interested, and had arrived, by the time his boots crossed the threshold, at a conclusion that was genuinely and equally both. Section 6. John Dutton had known three kinds of extraordinary men in his life. The first kind were extraordinary through circumstance. Men who had been present at the right moment when history needed someone to hold a line, and had held it and were shaped permanently by the holding. His father had been this kind. The war had made him, and the land had kept him, and he had passed both forward like a bequest that came with obligations attached. The second kind were extraordinary through will. Men who had decided, at some foundational level below conscious thought, that they would impose themselves on the world rather than receive its impositions, and had bent enough of reality to their purpose that reality had eventually accommodated them. John recognized this kind because he was this kind, or had been, in the years before the cost of that bending had become visible in his body and his family, and the particular loneliness of a man who has won most of his fights and is only now beginning to understand what winning has taken. The third kind he had encountered rarely and always with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not fear, not awe, but something older than both. Men who seemed to exist outside the normal accounting system of human experience. Men for whom the usual currencies, time, consequence, accumulation of damage, didn't appear to apply in the standard way. He'd met two in his life before now. One had been a Crow elder named Thomas Rainwater's grandfather, who had looked at John across a fire when John was 19 years old, with eyes that seemed to be watching something longer than a single lifetime. The other had been a soldier he'd known briefly in his 20s, whose name he'd never learned, and who had survived things in a manner that the surviving didn't adequately explain. He thought about both of them on the drive out to Clearwater. He'd decided to go himself. Not Rip, not Beth, not Jamie working angles from Helena. Him. Because some things required the principal, and John Dutton had not built what he'd built by sending intermediaries to the conversations that mattered. He found Logan at the end of the day, coming in from the eastern pasture on horseback. A dark bay gelding that Hauser kept for general work. Not a remarkable animal, but moving under Logan with the relaxed, a ground-covering stride of a horse that trusted its rider completely. That was the first thing John noted. Horses were honest about people in ways that people weren't honest about themselves. And a horse that moved like that under a relative stranger was making a statement. Logan saw him and rode over without urgency and dismounted and stood with the reins loose in his hand and waited, which was the correct thing to do and which John appreciated. A man who could wait without filling the silence was a man worth talking to. "Mr. Dutton," Logan said. "Logan," John said. He looked at him the way he looked at land he was considering, thoroughly without hurry, reading what the surface suggested about what was underneath. Up close, the quality that Rip had tried to describe and Beth had tried to leverage was more apparent and less categorizable. It wasn't physical exactly, though the physical was unusual enough. It was something in the temporal texture of the man, a sense that he was occupying the present moment from a greater depth than most people brought to it, the way a deep-keeled boat sits differently in water than a shallow one. "Walk with me," John said. They walked the fence line along the western edge of Clearwater's property as the sun dropped behind the mountains and the valley filled with the blue-gray light that preceded dark in this country. John talked about the land, not about Langley, not about the legal situation, not about what Beth had proposed or what Rip had reported, about the land itself, its history, and the specific character of this particular piece of valley, the way the creek drainage worked and what it meant for grazing rotation, and what the loss of it would mean for the broader watershed. Logan listened. He was a good listener, present, not performing attention, but actually paying it, his eyes moving across the landscape as John described it, as if he were cross-referencing the description against what he was seeing and finding them accurate. "You love this place," Logan said. Not a flattery, an observation. "It's not love," John said. "Love is something you feel. This is something I am." He paused. "You understand the difference?" Logan was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I do." John looked at him. "What are you that way about?" It was a direct question. Personal in a way that John Dutton didn't usually go with men he'd known less than a week, but he had not driven out here to have a careful conversation, and something in the quality of Logan's listening had earned a certain directness in return. Logan looked out at the mountains for a long moment. The last light was on the peaks now, the particular alpenglow, pink of high snow, catching what the valley had already lost. Used to be people, Logan said. Used to be a woman. Then it was just keeping the wrong things from happening to whoever was in front of me at the time. He paused. It's not a great answer. It's an honest one, John said. They walked in silence for a while. A coyote called from somewhere up the drainage and was answered from somewhere further, the two sounds triangulating something in the dark. A Rip told you what he saw, Logan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, John said. Beth made her pitch. She told me. And you came out here yourself, Logan said, which means you didn't come to make a pitch. You came to look at me. I came to talk to you, John said. Man to man, whatever that means in your case. Logan stopped walking. John stopped beside him. They stood at the fence line, with the dark coming down, and the first stars appearing above the eastern ridge, with the cold, indifferent punctuality of things that have been doing this for longer than either of them could meaningfully imagine. Ask it, Logan said. John looked at him steadily. How old are you? Logan was quiet for a moment. The coyotes called again, further now, moving up the drainage toward the high country. Old enough, he said. Aunt, that I've watched a lot of things worth protecting get lost because the people protecting them waited too long to decide what they were willing to do. He turned and looked at John with eyes that contained, in this light, something that justified every instinct John had brought out here. What are you willing to do, Mr. Dutton? Not your kids, not Rip, you. John Dutton had been asked versions of that question his entire life and had always had an answer. He had an answer now. He gave it quietly in the dark at the fence line, and Logan listened to the whole of it without interrupting. And when it was done, he nodded once with the slow, load-bearing finality of a man who has decided something he won't be undeciding. Then we understand each other, Logan said. They walked back to the trucks in the full dark, already two men moving through a landscape that had been fought over for 150 years and would be fought over again. And the question was only ever the same question it had always been. Not who was strongest, but who was willing to pay the actual price of holding something worth holding. Garrett Langley was not a stupid man. That was the problem with him. In the assessment of everyone who had dealt with him professionally, stupidity was manageable, predictable, containable within the normal architecture of opposition. Langley was intelligent in the specific way of men who had learned early that intelligence deployed without scruple was a force multiplier, and who had spent 2 decades in Montana real estate development refining that deployment into something approaching an art form. He knew which commissioners needed what, to which judges had what history, which state legislators had ambitions that exceeded their current salaries. He had built a network of obligation and leverage that extended from Bozeman to Helena and touched at its outermost edges money from outside the state that preferred not to be named in public documents. He had broken harder operations than Clearwater Ranch. He had never broken anything with John Dutton's name adjacent to it, which was why he had been careful so far to keep his Clearwater play technically separate from any direct confrontation with the Yellowstone. But the creek pasture was the key, and the creek pasture was adjacent to Dutton land. And at some point, the geometry of the situation was going to require him to stop being careful and start being direct. While he made that decision on a Monday morning in his Bozeman office with 3 people present, his lawyer, a political consultant named Greer, who had worked 2 gubernatorial campaigns, and a man named Doyle, who was introduced as a security consultant and whose actual function everyone in the room understood without its being stated. Hauser won't sell, his lawyer said. Hauser will sell, Langley said, when the cost of not selling exceeds the cost of selling. We haven't reached that number yet. The Duttons are involved now, Greer said. The Duttons are always involved, Langley said. That's the cost of operating in this valley. We manage the Duttons the way we've always managed them. Through Helena, through the regulatory apparatus, through time. John Dutton is not a young man. Doyle, who had said nothing, Erie said, there's a variable on the Clearwater payroll. Everyone looked at him. A hand named Logan, Doyle said. Canadian, probably. no real history, showed up 6 weeks ago. He placed a photograph on the conference table, taken from distance, slightly blurred. Logan at the fence line in the late afternoon. My people tried to run a comprehensive background check. There's almost nothing, which isn't a red flag, it's a wall. Walls like that don't happen by accident. What does that mean practically? Langley asked. It means someone built it, Doyle said. And the people who build walls like that are either intelligence community, military black program, or something we don't have a category for yet. He paused. My guy in Gardner says the man put his hand through a pine board last week at the feed store. Accident. A board was in the wrong place, and there was no injury. None. Man didn't even look at his hand. The room was quiet for a moment. So he's tough, Langley said. He's something, Doyle said. The escalation arrived at Clearwater on a Wednesday in the form of a certified letter, a water rights challenge filed through the state engineer's office, and 3 separate regulatory complaints lodged with the Montana Department of Livestock, all on the same day, all targeting different aspects of Hauser's operation, with the precision of a man who has done his homework and is now deploying it simultaneously on multiple fronts to maximize the administrative burden. Hauser sat at his kitchen table that evening, with the letters arranged in front of him and the expression of a man watching a flood come and calculating whether his sandbags will hold. Logan sat across from him. Eddie was at the counter. Cody had been sent to town for supplies because this wasn't a conversation for Cody. This is coordinated, Hauser said. Same day, 3 different agencies. Someone spent money on this. Yes, Logan said. This is what Beth Dutton warned you about, Hauser said. He looked at Logan with the direct, undecorated attention of a man who has been carrying a suspicion and has decided to surface it. She came out here. You two talked. We talked, Logan said. And? She wanted me to help in a way I wasn't willing to help, Logan said. I told her I was here as a ranch hand. That's still what I am. Hauser looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had come up again, working at the eaves with the repetitive, patient persistence of something that has time on its side. Well, and you're not just a ranch hand, Hauser said. Not accusatory, just accurate. I'm your ranch hand, Logan said, for whatever that's worth to you right now. Hauser nodded slowly. He picked up the letter from the Department of Livestock and read it again with the careful attention of a man who is looking for something to hold on to in the language and not finding it. I need a lawyer, he said. You need the Dutton's lawyer, Logan said, which means you need to call John Dutton. Calling John Dutton means owing John Dutton, Hauser said. Not calling him, Logan said, might mean losing Clearwater. The kitchen was quiet. The wind worked at the eaves. Eddie refilled his coffee without being asked and set a cup in front of Logan and one in front of Hauser and resumed his position at the counter with the quiet, steady presence of a man who has seen difficult situations and understands that the most useful thing he can offer right now is not to add to the noise. Logan drove out after midnight, not to the Dutton Ranch. He hadn't been invited there, and arriving uninvited at John Dutton's house after midnight was a statement he wasn't ready to make. He drove to the county road and parked where the Yellowstone River was visible as a dark movement in the moonlight below the cottonwoods and sat with the engine off and the window down and let the cold come in. He was thinking about Doyle. He hadn't seen Doyle, but he'd smelled him. 2 days ago, on the road above the eastern pasture, a parked vehicle with the engine off and a man inside with the specific chemical signature of someone in a surveillance posture. The particular blend of synthetic fabric, gun oil, and the suppressed metabolic output of a trained person trying to be still. Logan had noted it and filed it and said nothing, because noting things and saying nothing was a habit built over more decades than he wanted to count. Doyle was a professional. That meant Langley had moved past the lawyer and surveyor phase and into a phase that had a different kind of grammar. Logan sat by the river and thought about what he'd told Beth. I'm not a weapon. And thought about what John had said at the fence line about what he was willing to do, and thought about what Hauser's face had looked like in the kitchen light going over those letters. Or he thought about a woman he'd known in Alberta 30 years ago who had owned 40 acres of good land and had lost it incrementally to a resource company through exactly this kind of administrative attrition, death by paperwork, by regulatory interference, by the slow suffocation of a life's work through processes too diffuse and numerous to fight directly. He had not helped her. He had told himself it wasn't his fight. He was still telling himself things like that. He had gotten very good at it. The river moved in the dark below him, cold and indifferent and continuous, doing what rivers do regardless of what happens on the land around them, which was either comforting or infuriating, depending on the night. Tonight, it was infuriating. Logan started the truck and drove back toward Clearwater, and in the morning he called the one number he'd kept from a life he'd nominally retired from. Not the X-Men, not Fury, nobody with a helicarrier or a mutant database. A woman in Calgary who had spent 30 years as a forensic accountant before moving into a kind of practice that didn't have a clean professional name, who owed him something significant from a situation in Vancouver that he hadn't mentioned to anyone in Montana and wasn't going to start now. "I need everything on a man named Garrett Langley," he said. "Bozeman, Montana. Real estate, and whatever's behind him." "How deep?" she asked. "All the way," he said. The file arrived encrypted on a burner phone 3 days later, and Logan read it in the cab of the Clearwater truck parked behind the barn in the early morning dark, with the heater running and the particular focused stillness of a man processing information that confirms what he suspected while adding dimensions he hadn't anticipated. Garrett Langley was the visible surface. That much had been clear from the beginning. What the file revealed was the architecture beneath the surface, a layered ownership structure that moved through 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. A real estate investment trust headquartered nominally in Calgary but operationally directed from an address in Houston, and at the terminus of that chain, a private equity firm called Meridian Land Partners that managed approximately $4 billion in assets and had a board of directors whose names, read carefully, was described a particular geography of American political and economic power. One name on that board was a former U.S. senator from Montana who had retired 4 years ago and gone immediately into private consulting and had, in the intervening years, developed a relationship with the current governor's office that the Calgary accountant had documented through campaign finance records, meeting logs obtained through a Freedom of Information request, and 3 years of careful cross-referencing that added up to something that stopped short of provable corruption by exactly the margin that experienced people in that world knew to maintain. The water rights challenge and the livestock complaints hadn't come from Langley's office. They had come from Helena, from inside the regulatory apparatus itself, filed by career bureaucrats who had received guidance through channels that were technically legal and practically indistinguishable from instruction. Logan sat with this for a long time. Then he drove to the Dutton Ranch. He'd called ahead this time. Rip had answered, listened to 3 sentences and said, "Come now," which Logan took as an indication that the situation had developed on the Dutton end as well, and that his information was arriving at a moment of convergence rather than initiation. The main house was lit when he arrived at 7 in the morning. Beth was at the kitchen table with a laptop and 3 phones, and the focused, predatory energy of a woman who had been working since before dawn on something that had her full attention, which was both impressive and faintly alarming. Rip was at the counter with coffee, much positioned with the unconscious, tactical awareness of a man who placed himself in rooms with sight lines to all entry points. John was at the head of the table with the stillness of a man conserving himself for what was coming. Logan sat down and put the burner phone on the table and told them what was in the file. He didn't editorialize. He didn't frame it or contextualize it or offer conclusions. He presented the information the way it had been given to him. Structured, sequential, documented, and let them process it at the speed their experience allowed. Beth processed it fastest. She was leaning forward before he'd finished the 3rd paragraph, her eyes bright with the particular intensity of a person who has just received a weapon they already knew how to use. "Meridian," she said. "I know that fund. I crossed them twice in market transactions when I was at Schwarzmeyer. They play very long, very quiet, and they do not lose." She looked at Logan. "How did you get this?" "Someone I know," Logan said. "Someone you know," Beth repeated with the tone of a woman filing the inadequacy of that answer for later address. "This former senator, don't touch him yet," John said. Everyone looked at him. "If we move on the senator before we have something airtight, we give them warning and they restructure," John said. "Everything goes deeper. The paper trail gets cleaner, and we've burned our one moment of surprise. He looked at Logan. Can your source keep going? Deeper into the financials? Yes, Logan said. Then that's what we do, John said. Beth works what she can work through legitimate channels, the shell company structure, and the REIT filings, anything that can be surfaced in a way that doesn't reveal the source. Jamie continues in Helena, but now he knows what he's actually looking at. He paused. And we deal with Doyle. The name landed in the room with a specific weight. He knows about you, Rip said to Logan. Not an accusation, a tactical statement. He knows something's wrong with my background, Logan said. He doesn't know what. He'll keep looking, Rip said. Yes, Logan said. So we get to him first, Beth said. No, Logan and John said simultaneously, which produced a brief silence and a look between them that contained something that might, in different company, have been called mutual recognition. We don't touch Doyle, John said. We let him look. Because right now what Doyle knows is that there's an anomalous variable on the Clearwater payroll. If we move on him, we confirm that the variable is worth moving on. We leave him looking and finding nothing, and we use the time that buys us. Doyle was, in fact, finding nothing. He was a thorough man, and he had resources, and he had spent 4 days pursuing Logan's background through channels that had reliably produced results on every previous subject he'd investigated. And what he had at the end of 4 days was a series of walls so clean and consistent that they had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like construction. Someone had not merely failed to leave a record. Someone had actively removed one. In the precision of that removal implied resources and institutional access that placed it beyond the capacity of any individual and within the capacity of maybe 6 organizations in North America. He reported this to Langley on a Thursday afternoon. Langley listened without expression. What's your recommendation? Back off the physical pressure on Clearwater, Doyle said. The regulatory approach continues. That's clean. That's deniable. That's the play. But the personal pressure, the site visits, the survey crews, we stop that. We don't know what we're dealing with, and until we do, we don't want to be the ones who escalate. Langley considered this. He was a man who had built his operation on the principle that information asymmetry was the fundamental advantage in any competitive situation. And right now, the information asymmetry was running the wrong direction, which was an unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable sensation. Fine, he said. Regulatory only, for now. What none of them knew, not Langley, not Doyle, not even Beth with her $4 billion research, was that Logan had walked the full perimeter of the Clearwater property at 3 in the morning on each of the last 5 nights. Not because anyone asked him to, not as part of any plan or tactical framework. Because he had slept badly since Vancouver, and walking at night in country like this was the closest thing he had, currently, to peace. The cold and the dark and the smell of the river and the specific quality of silence that existed here between 2 and 4 a.m. 1 a.m. when even the coyotes had gone quiet, and the only sound was the grass moving and his own boots on the frozen ground. On the 3rd night, he had found Doyle's observation point, a shallow depression in the tree line above the eastern pasture, carefully chosen for sightlines, with the compressed grass and the faint chemical residue of a man who had spent several nights there. He had stood in the depression for a moment and looked at the ranch the way Doyle had been looking at it, and understood what Doyle had been trying to see. He had not disturbed anything. He had walked back down to the ranch and gone to bed, but he had left something in the depression. Not a threat, not a message, not anything that could be photographed or documented. Just a single adamantium claw mark in the bark of the pine tree at the observation point's edge. Deep, clean, the width of something no known tool produced, something for Doyle to think about, something to communicate in the only language that certain conversations required, that the variable was aware of the observation, and that the variable was not concerned. The claw mark worked. Doyle found it on Friday morning and stood looking at it for a long time with the expression of a man whose professional framework has just been handed something it cannot process and is deciding between 2 responses, escalate or withdraw, with the understanding that choosing wrong in either direction carries consequences he cannot fully model. He photographed it. He sent the photograph to a contact at a private security firm in Washington, D.C. that had among its roster of consultants several people with backgrounds in programs that didn't appear in any public defense budget. He received a response in 4 hours that consisted of two sentences. The first sentence said, "Do not engage directly." The second sentence said, "Walk away from this contract." Doyle was a professional, and professionals respected good intelligence. He called Langley that afternoon and resigned the contract with a brevity that communicated more than the words themselves. And Langley, who was also not a stupid man, heard what the brevity was saying and sat with it in his Bozeman office for a long time after the call ended. The problem was that Langley had already committed too much to walk away cleanly. The Meridian board was expecting results. The former senator had made representations to people in Helena on the basis of a timeline that was now behind schedule. The regulatory pressure on Clearwater was producing results. Hauser had missed a loan payment for the first time in 11 years, a fact that Langley's bank contact had surfaced discreetly. But results through attrition required time, and time had a cost, and the cost was currently being expressed to Langley in communications from Houston that had grown noticeably less collegial over the past 2 weeks. He made the decision that people in his position always eventually made when the careful approach stopped producing adequate velocity. He decided to accelerate, not through Doyle. Doyle was gone, and what Doyle had communicated about the Logan situation meant that direct physical pressure on Clearwater was off the table. But there were other kinds of pressure. The loan default gave him a banking angle. The water rights challenge, if pushed through the state engineer's office on an expedited basis, could force a court date within 60 days that would cost Hauser more in legal fees than his operating margin could absorb. And there was a third angle that Langley had been holding in reserve, a conversation with the county assessor's office about a property valuation adjustment that would increase Hauser's tax liability by an amount carefully calculated to be just above the threshold of what his current cash position could service. 3 simultaneous financial pressure points. No physical confrontation. Nothing that touched the Logan variable. He put it in motion on a Monday. Beth found out on Tuesday. She found out because Beth had been running her own parallel operation since the morning Logan had brought the Meridian file to the kitchen table, working through channels that operated in the space between legitimate and otherwise, with the practiced comfort of a woman who had spent her career in that space and had never found its moral ambiguity particularly troubling. She had a contact at the county assessor's office. Not bought, nothing so crude. Just a person who had once needed something that Beth had been positioned to provide, and who had understood, without it being stated, that the provision of that something created a certain ongoing conversational relationship. The contact called Beth on Tuesday morning and told her about the valuation adjustment request. Beth sat with this information for approximately 90 seconds, which was the amount of time she needed to understand the full architecture of what Langley had assembled and identify the precise point in that architecture where a lever, correctly applied, would produce maximum structural damage. Then she called Jamie. Jamie had been in Helena for 3 weeks and had arrived at the position of a man who has been digging towards something and can feel, in the change resistance of the ground, that he is close. The Meridian connection had given him a framework. The shell company filings had given him a thread. What he needed was a single documented instance of the former senator's influence being applied to a specific regulatory decision in a way that moved from the circumstantial to the evidentiary. And what Beth's assessor contact had just provided was exactly that. A communication chain that ran from Langley's office through a Meridian lobbyist, to a staffer in the former senator's consulting firm, to a person inside the assessor's office, documented in emails that the staffer had, with spectacular professional imprudence, sent from a government account. Jamie called a journalist he trusted at the Helena Independent Record, not to publish, not yet, to hold, to have a credible, documented story ready to move the moment was right, which was a form of leverage more reliable than any legal filing, because it operated on a timeline that Langley couldn't control and in a form that his regulatory relationships couldn't reach. Logan knew none of this on Tuesday evening. What he knew on Tuesday evening was that Hauser had received 3 separate pieces of bad financial news in the same day, and was sitting at the kitchen table with the letters and the look of a man doing arithmetic that kept arriving at the same answer. Cody had made coffee and retreated to the bunkhouse with the instinct of a young man who recognizes when adults need space for something difficult. Eddie sat at the counter as he always sat, present, steady, saying nothing that wasn't necessary. Logan read the letters. He read them carefully in sequence. And when he was done, he set them on the table and looked at the pattern of them and felt something move through him that he had spent a long time learning to manage. Not anger exactly, though anger was present. Something older and more structural. The recognition of a specific kind of predation, the kind that works through systems rather than bodies, that destroys through process rather than violence, and that is in many ways harder to oppose because it offers nothing to put your claws into. He had put his claws into things for 150 years. He was not supposed to be doing that anymore. He looked at Hauser, who had built this ranch over 30 years and had never missed a loan payment until this month, and who was looking at the letters with the expression of a man watching something he loved being taken from him by mechanisms he couldn't fight with any tool he possessed. Carl, Logan said, Hauser's first name, which he had not used before. Hauser looked up. This doesn't end tonight. This doesn't end this week, but it ends. He said it with the specific flatness of a statement rather than a reassurance. Not I think it will be okay, but this is what is going to happen. And Hauser, who was a man with good instincts about the difference, heard it correctly. How do you know? Hauser asked. Because I know what's moving on the other side of this, Logan said. And I know what's moving on ours. And ours is better. What moved on theirs arrived on Thursday. Jamie filed a motion in district court that, using the documented communication chain Beth's contact had provided, challenged the expedited water rights proceeding on grounds of regulatory capture. A legal theory that was aggressive and not certain to succeed, but which, when combined with the existence of a journalist in Helena holding a documented story about a former senator's involvement in what could now be characterized as a coordinated campaign of regulatory harassment against a private landowner, created a situation that Langley's people in Houston recognized immediately as a liability that exceeded the value of the creek pasture. The Meridian Board convened an emergency call. The former senator, informed of the documentation in Jamie's filing, Anat made a phone call to Langley that lasted 4 minutes and ended with Langley understanding that he was now operating without the political infrastructure that had made the whole play viable. But Langley, stripped of his infrastructure, made the mistake that careful men make when they stop being careful. He sent Doyle back, not for surveillance, not for documentation, for something simpler and more direct, a conversation with Hauser alone that would communicate in unambiguous terms that the financial pressure would not stop, that the legal challenge would be countered, and that the easiest path for everyone was for Hauser to name his price and end this. Doyle drove out to Clearwater on a Thursday night. He arrived at 11 p.m. and found the ranch yard dark and quiet. He found something else too. Logan was sitting on the steps of the bunkhouse in the cold dark, not doing anything, just sitting there with his forearms on his knees and his breath showing in the night air, and Doyle's headlights swept across him as the truck came through the gate, and Doyle stopped the truck and sat there with the engine running, and the two of them looking at each other through the windshield. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Doyle had been told not to engage directly. He had been told by people who knew things. He looked at the man on the bunkhouse steps in the wash of his headlights, and he thought about the claw mark in the pine tree, and he thought about the 2 sentences he'd received from Washington, and he thought about what the second sentence had specifically said. He put the truck in reverse. He drove back to Bozeman, and he called Langley from the road and said 4 words. Find another piece of land. The valley didn't celebrate. That was the thing about this kind of country. It didn't mark victories the way other places did, with noise and ceremony and the public acknowledgement of outcomes. The land absorbed what happened on it with the same impassive continuity it brought to everything else, the same indifference to human drama that made it both humbling and clarifying to live in. The creek still ran, the cattle still needed moving, the fence lines still required attention. The mountains did not care what Meridian Land Partners had decided in an emergency board call, and the Yellowstone River continued its conversation with its banks without reference to Jamie Dutton's district court filing or the Helena independent record journalist who had, When with the story now moot as a publication, but valuable as a permanent deterrent, filed it in a drawer where it would wait with the patient, loaded quality of a weapon that doesn't need to be fired to do its work. Langley's operation withdrew over the course of 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not with any public acknowledgement, but in the quiet administrative language of organizations that have decided a position is no longer tenable. The regulatory complaints were dropped. The water rights challenge was withdrawn without explanation. The property valuation adjustment request was quietly rescinded by the assessor's office with a bureaucratic neutrality that communicated nothing and implied everything. The shell companies associated with the Clearwater acquisition were dissolved in Delaware on a Tuesday morning. And by the following Friday, there was almost no documentary evidence that the play had ever been attempted, which was itself a form of information about how experienced these people were at not existing when existing became inconvenient. Hauser made his loan payment. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who processed things through language. He processed them through work. And in the 2 weeks following the withdrawal, he worked with an intensity that Eddie recognized and respected, and Cody found exhausting, and Logan understood completely. The specific physical energy of a man who has been close to losing something and is reacquainting himself with it through his hands. When touching the fence posts and the water troughs and the cattle and the cold morning air of his own land, with the heightened attention of someone who has been reminded that possession is not permanent and is choosing, consciously, to be present in it while it's his. John Dutton came out to Clearwater on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Doyle's final visit. He came alone, which meant something. He found Logan and Hauser together in the barn working on a piece of equipment that had needed attention since September and had finally reached the top of the priority list now that the more urgent things had resolved. John stood in the barn doorway for a moment with the cold light behind him and looked at the two men working and at the barn itself. Its organization, its state of repair, was the evidence of a working operation maintained with care over decades, with the particular attention of a man who has spent his life reading land and the people on it. Hauser looked up. "John! Carl!" John looked around the barn once more. Good operation. Coming from John Dutton, in this valley, that was a specific kind of statement. Hauser received it with a nod that contained more than the nod's surface suggested. John looked at Logan. "Walk with me." They walked the eastern fence line again, the same route they'd walked in the dark 6 weeks ago, now in the full winter morning light with the snow on the peaks, sharp and white, against a sky so blue it looked manufactured, and the grass in the pasture below cured to the color of pale gold. The cold was serious now. Real Montana winter asserting itself with the flat. It's a clear authority of a season that doesn't negotiate, and their breath showed and their boots broke the frost on the grass with a sound like something being gently corrected. John walked with his hands in his jacket pockets and the particular forward-leaning posture of a man who has always moved toward things rather than away from them, and whose body had encoded that orientation so deeply it was now simply how he occupied space. "Langley's done," John said. "Yes," Logan said. "Meridian will try something else, somewhere else, eventually," John said. "Different mechanism, different target, different valley." "Probably," Logan said. "Nothing we can do about that," John said. "No," Logan said. John was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned slow circles above the creek drainage, patient and precise, in reading the ground below with the focused detachment of something that sees the whole picture from sufficient altitude. "Hauser wants to offer you a permanent position," John said. "Year-round. Better pay, housing allowance, stake in the operation if you stay 3 years. Logan looked at the fence line running to the horizon, the posts he'd helped set, the wire running clean and taut in the cold morning light. "I know," he said. "He told me." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd think about it." John nodded. He walked another 20 yards in silence before speaking again, and when he spoke it was with the careful, undecorated directness of a man who has earned the right to say difficult things plainly. "You're not built for permanent," John said, not unkindly, as an observation about the nature of a thing, with the way you describe the particular quality of a piece of land, not a judgment, just an accurate reading. Logan was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I've known men like you," John said. Not exactly like you, but the type. Men who have been through enough that the world stopped being a place they live in and became a place they move through. He paused. The ones who tried to stop moving, it didn't go well for them, or for the people around them. You're telling me to leave, Logan said. I'm telling you what I've observed, John said. What you do with it is your business. They reached the corner post where the fence line turned south toward the creek and stood there for a moment with the full expanse of the valley visible below them. The river a dark line through the pale grass. The Dutton operation visible to the west as a series of structures against the landscape. Smoke rising from the main house. The whole of it held together by the specific human will of the family that had refused, generation after generation, to let it go. Your family's going to be all right, Logan said. John looked at him. I mean it, Logan said. I've seen operations that weren't going to make it. Families that were going to lose. Yours isn't. You've got Rip, and you've got Beth, and you've got Case, and underneath all of it, you've got the thing that actually holds land. The willingness to pay whatever it costs. That's not common. He paused. Don't waste it on men like Langley. They're not the real threat. What's the real threat? John asked. Logan looked at the mountains for a long moment. Time, he said. Syria and the things time does to the people who carry something worth carrying. The weight of it, the loneliness of it. He turned and looked at John with the eyes of a man speaking from an experience of duration that John could only partially imagine. You already know that. I'm just confirming it. John Dutton looked at him for a long time with the expression of a man receiving something he already knew and finding it different, heavier, more real, for being said aloud by someone with sufficient authority to say it. You leaving today? John asked. Tomorrow, Logan said. John nodded. He put out his hand, and Logan took it, and they shook once, firmly, with the clean simplicity of men who have said what needed saying and don't require ceremony around it. They walked back to the trucks without talking, the frost still on the north-facing grass, where the morning sun hadn't reached it yet, the hawk still turning above the drainage, the mountains doing what mountains do, standing there, indifferent and permanent and magnificent, the longest argument against impermanence that the world has to offer. Logan left the next morning before light. He said goodbye to Eddie, who shook his hand and said nothing. He said goodbye to Cody, who said way too much and meant all of it. He left an envelope for Hauser on the kitchen table. Not a note, just the 2 weeks of pay he felt he hadn't fully earned, returned in cash in the direct, uncomplicated way of a man who keeps his own accounts. He walked out to the county road with his duffel and stood in the dark and cold with his breath showing and the stars still up and the mountains invisible against the dark sky, but present. You could feel them, the particular weight of that much rock and altitude on the air. A truck stopped. Different driver, same basic arrangement as the one that had dropped him here. The door swung open. Logan got in. The truck moved west, then north, following the river for a while before the road curved away from it into higher country. And behind them the valley lay quiet in the last dark before dawn. Hauser's barn light coming on, Rip Wheeler's truck already moving on the Dutton Road, John Dutton standing on his porch with coffee and the mountains and the particular expression of a man who is still here, still holding, still refusing to be moved. The truck crested a rise and the valley disappeared behind it. Logan watched the darkness outside the window and felt the familiar settling of motion, the specific quality of being between places, which was the closest thing he had to home. He had not fixed anything permanent. He had helped hold something that deserved to be held for long enough that the people who were built for holding could get their footing back. That was all. That was enough. The road unrolled ahead of them into the dark. Somewhere ahead was whatever came next, which was all any direction had ever offered him, and which he had learned, across a length of years that would have broken most things, to accept as sufficient. In the end, what Logan left behind in that Montana valley was not the memory of claws or impossible healing or the silence that fell when he entered a room. What he left was simpler and more durable than any of that. He left the fence posts he'd set straight in frozen ground. He left the calf he'd pulled in the blue dark of a November morning. He left a claw mark in a pine tree that Doyle would never fully explain, and that would eventually become, in the telling and retelling among the men who worked that valley, a story whose details changed with each version, but whose meaning stayed consistent. Something had been here, something that didn't fit any category, and it had been on the right side of things. Rip Wheeler never spoke about what he'd seen in the woodpile. But on the rare occasions when someone new came to work on the Dutton operation and asked about Clearwater and the Langley situation, he would get a particular expression, not quite a smile, not quite anything else, and say that Hauser had good people working for him at the right time, and leave it at that. Beth Dutton, who left nothing on the table and acknowledged nothing she couldn't use, kept the burner phone number in a locked file on a server whose existence she had disclosed to no one. She told herself it was operational prudence. She did not examine that explanation too carefully. John Dutton stood on his porch the morning after Logan left and looked at his valley in the first light and thought about what Logan had said. Time. Rhiannon and the things time does to the people who carry something worth carrying, and felt the truth of it in his back and his hands and the specific tiredness that lived behind his eyes these days, and made the decision, quiet and private and without ceremony, to say certain things to his children that he had been postponing in the way that men who are accustomed to having time postpone the things that require them to acknowledge they don't. Logan himself was in Wyoming by nightfall and Idaho by the following evening, and after that the road took him where it took him, which was the only itinerary he'd ever been able to rely on. The mountains stood, the river ran, the land endured.